Waltzing Among the Willows by Aurora Schlosswald. Chapter 3. Wanted for fleeing the law. Despite the intricate designs on the carpet and the embroidered upholstery that graced her chair, Eleanor's eyes were immediately drawn to the vase of roses on the marble counter. "Is it to your liking, Mrs. Cunningham?" the steward queried. "Very much." She slipped him a pound. "My thanks to you, sir." She knew she was in for a great deal of trouble if her secret were ever discovered. Somewhere in the darkness, a wealthy widow who had thought to enjoy a lavish stay in New York was now frantically searching for her missing papers, including her ticket to board the ship. After a lifetime of theft, Eleanor felt no pity, for she knew no other way of life than what Lyons had taught her since childhood. Was she truly to blame if other people allowed important items to slip from their bags and satchels so easily? The night Lyons died, Eleanor had packed her luggage, including important photographs and the artifacts she had collected during her travels, and gathered all his money and valuables, withdrawing the rest of his savings from the bank the following morning. Rather than going to the police station as she had promised, she had taken the first train out of London, not caring where its intended destination might be. If Scotland Yard already knew everything about Lyons, it would only be a matter of time before they discovered her own guilt, and what then would become of her? There was no doubt in her mind that she had to leave London for a short while. When the train came to a stop, she found herself near a port where a ship was scheduled to depart the following morning. After eavesdropping on various conversations, she had overheard an elderly woman talking about boarding the ship, so without a thought to where the vessel might be going, Eleanor had secured passage. Judging from the way the woman had been dressed, Eleanor suspected the ticket was most likely saloon class, and to her delight, she was correct. However, she would gladly have accepted a ticket for steerage if it meant she was able to sail away before the bobbies found her. Since her ticket was for saloon class, Eleanor was permitted to board the ship the evening before it set sail. A baggage steward immediately offered to take her luggage, and at her approval, he began gathering it as she spoke with the ship's surgeon. "Good evening, Mrs. Cunningham," he greeted. "I'm Dr. Tiburon." "A pleasure, doctor," she smiled. "I've traveled many times before, so I understand what you must do. I have no health concerns to hide." She averted her eyes as he examined her face and neck. Although she had been told that there was a difference between a doctor's scrutinizing gaze and a layman's lustful stare, she was still uncomfortable with the fact that certain men had the right to touch her at will simply because they had received higher education. How did married men approve of their wives being examined by strangers? How did fathers ever allow unrelated males to stare at and touch their daughters? Eleanor lived in fear that the day would arrive when she injured her foot and was thus required to display her ankle. "May I see your hands?" the physician requested. She hesitated. A woman who showed her ungloved hands to anyone outside her family was utterly immodest. Although other doctors had asked to see her hands in the days when she had traveled with Lyons, Eleanor was now old enough to consider that she might one day be married, so she understood the importance of guarding her chastity. How would a young bride explain to her new husband on their wedding night that she had once exposed her hands to another man? How could a woman live with herself when her conscience consistently reminded her of this great wickedness she had done in allowing someone else not only to see her bare hands, but to scrutinize them? Health seemed a poor excuse for such lewd conduct. "Part of one?" Eleanor managed a terse nod. As Dr. Tiburon averted his eyes, she removed one glove and wrapped it around her hand, showing only the tip of her thumb. Her face reddened with shame as he glanced briefly and nodded before turning away again so she could put on her glove. "Almost finished. I just need you to remove your hat so I may examine your hair." She reluctantly obeyed. Why weren't female doctors more common? Although the procedure would still have been too immodest for comfort, Eleanor would have felt much more at ease in the presence of another woman. "There now, you're free to board." The purser immediately greeted Eleanor, handing her the keys to her stateroom, as well as a passenger list and deck plans. After unpacking her luggage, Eleanor sat in a chair on the deck and watched the sun set as she wrote in her diary. She found it a futile waste of time to write private thoughts about her daily life that no one else would ever read, for she was already fully aware of all that crossed her mind. Why then should she bother recording it? She had also been taught from an early age never to write about the work she did for lions, for life was full of cruel irony, and it was quite likely that although the rest of her written words would forever be ignored, the day would inevitably arrive when the police read of any and all crimes she mentioned in her book. However, Eleanor faithfully described her adventures abroad in great detail. No one could escape age, and when she became too old to travel, she would at least have the stories to remember the places she had once visited, and she could laugh at humorous stories or shake her head at past frustrations as the memories once more allowed her soul to see the destinations she had loved so much. Now she wrote about her beloved London and life at the mansion. She penned every memory that crossed her mind of the sites she had once frequented, describing in great detail how the physical settings affected her emotions. Despite her promises to herself that she would soon return, Eleanor had no way of knowing how long she would have to be in exile. For all she knew, several months may pass before she was able to return home. If anything unfortunate should occur during that time, she may never again see the city of her birth. If it took all night, she would make London exist forever in the pages of her diary, that she may be reunited with her cherished homeland each time she opened the book. Any future generations who somehow discovered the diary would know what life was like for wealthy Londoners during the reign of Queen Victoria, as well as how life had been for orphans. As the ship set sail the following morning, she stood on the deck and waved. She was nervous. If any of Mrs. Cunningham's friends were on board, they would soon discover Eleanor's deception. In addition to lounges and dining halls, the ship also had 2 baths and a vast library, where Eleanor spent most of her time. Many works were by authors she had met, and she smiled fondly as she remembered documenting such encounters in previous diaries, all of which she had stowed in her luggage. She would also pass the time by walking around on deck, admiring the various shades of blue and gray as she stared at the ocean. Although many passengers socialized and gossiped with each other, Eleanor kept to herself. The midday meal always consisted of no fewer than 10 courses. Eleanor usually drank lemonade, although she would take a cup of tea after supper and a cup of coffee or juice with breakfast. Alone in her stateroom each night, she was haunted by the memory of what Lyons had done. What had his motives been? Had he been doing her a kindness by taking her in when she had nothing, offering her a life beyond anything she could have dreamed, or had he been executing cruelty and forcing her into crime, knowing she had nowhere else to go if she refused to accept the lifestyle he set before her? Had he truly loved her as if she were his own daughter, or had he seen in her only an accomplice? The uncertainty made it difficult for her to know how to feel about his death. Should she mourn his loss or be angry that he had set her up to be forced into choosing exile or arrest? What had happened between Lyons and Garrison? Was there anyone who could ever tell her about their former friendship that had somehow grown into rancor? If they had truly been enemies, why had Garrison's final act in the world been an attempt to give Lyons one last chance to escape? After spending over a week on the ship, Eleanor finally saw land on the horizon. When she disembarked, she held her breath as she interacted with customs officials, but to her astonishment, they merely held a brief conversation before dismissing her. She could scarcely believe her good fortune. Not once had anyone discovered her true identity, and now she no longer had to conceal it. She immediately bought a newspaper. To her surprise, the headlines were not about any local event, but an occurrence in London. As she read, Eleanor discovered that the day after Lyons perished, the police had conducted an extensive search of his mansion, leading to the arrest of most of his men, many of whom had shared information about his accomplice in an attempt to reduce their own sentences. So far, the police had no idea where this woman could be, but they were offering a substantial reward to anyone who managed to help them locate her. Rather than live in fear of extradition, she walked to the nearest train station. "How may I help you?" the man behind the counter greeted. "I should like to secure passage on the next available train, please," she answered cordially. "I understand perfectly," he smiled kindly. "You've read about the American West and you want to see it for yourself." She nodded, hoping her eyes reflected the enthusiasm she was pretending to feel. "That's one ticket to Willows. Boarding begins in about an hour." For days, Eleanor stared out the window as the crowded cities of the East Coast gave way to mountains. At daybreak, the blue shadows greatly resembled the rolling waves of the ocean, especially when tinges of fog reminded her of the waves' white tips, and she found herself frequently writing in her diary. When the train passed waterfalls, she could scarcely breathe. As the train continued its journey, she no longer saw mountains, but dense forest of various hues of green. She wondered what sorts of animals lived there. Were there some in this vast expanse of wilderness that had never before seen a human? The landscape changed yet again, and the train was surrounded by miles of tall grass in every direction. Although there were still plenty of trees on the flat land, they were much farther apart than in the forest, but she could see there were still small patches of woodland scattered throughout the prairie. When the wind blew across the green and gold grasslands, they bowed, causing a ripple of sunlight to pass over them, reminding Eleanor once again of the waves on the ocean. Finally, the train stopped and Eleanor checked into the nearest hotel. Although her room was comfortable enough, it was nowhere near as luxurious as her accommodations on the ship had been. There was a bed, a nightstand, and a chair, but the carpet was a plain color, and the walls had not been so much as painted. Furthermore, the entire room was smaller than most closets she had seen. "What brings you out to these parts?" the attendant queried as he set down her luggage. "I was rather intrigued by tales of the American West," she replied. "I wish to see it for myself." "Well, if'n you want to see the desert, you gotta go out a fur piece. If'n you want to see a cattle drive, you can just wait here for a spell. We got the railroad that ships them off, but the folks of Prairie Grass is getting too big for their britches. They figured out that the drovers was coming near their town afore reaching ourn, so they built corrals. Now them cattle drivers will stop a day or two in Prairie Grass and buy things they need at lower prices than what we got here. Then they'll bring the herds here to our railroad. Usually, drovers ain't got no money afore they sell the herd, but a lot of trail bosses will give 'em a little credit when they get to Prairie Grass. We got the last laugh, though. Our town's growing more and more every year, and we're like a small city now. But Prairie Grass ain't growing none at all, and it's still surrounded by miles of nothing." "City? How could a town of several hundred people consider themselves to be a city? London had perhaps 4 million inhabitants." "I am intrigued by Prairie Grass," Eleanor stated. He shrugged. "Suit yourself, but there ain't nothing out there. Stage runs every 2 weeks if'n you want to go. Town's so small they ain't got everything they need, so the locals are always eager customers if'n you sell goods or know a trade. Folks can make good money going out there." "Tell me more about these cattle drives." The man explained that many of the drovers were Mexican, indigenous, or African American. He had even heard of some Asian immigrants who drove cattle in states further west, although many of these people were miners, railroad workers, shopkeepers, or vineyard owners. Despite the various shops that lined the street, which was filled with pedestrians and the occasional wagon, Eleanor could hardly bear the silence. To someone who lived in a log cabin on the prairie, perhaps Willows was a bustling city, but to a Londoner, the town was a wasteland. She dreaded the thought of going to Prairie Grass, but who could possibly find her in a town that had no railroad?